We're studying together. We made mention of a couple of different concepts that we see throughout the book of Genesis, especially beginning within the garden. We made mention of some of the ideas of the temple and of the tabernacle and of the church and of Jesus and of the garden, how each of these things play a role within each other. That one is a blueprint for the other. Does anybody not have a handout for this? It should be lesson number 2. Journey to Jesus, lesson 2, the seed of woman. We've got number 3 printed up, but we haven't, I don't think, did we hand them out last week? I can't remember. No, we didn't. Okay. I'm not expecting us to get to 3 tonight, but if we do, then we'll rapidly hand those out and we'll get into 3. But one of the things that we made mention of is these principles or these ideas being placed even from the beginning of the garden and seen throughout the entirety of the Bible. We witness these places where man and God can exist in the same realm, or at least within contact of one another. And one of the things that we made mention of there towards the end of the class is the idea that never again has man been able to exist in the presence of God the way that Adam and Eve did within the garden. Now, that's the goal of the Bible. That's the goal of Jesus' redemption of man. That's the goal of God's plan for salvation, is for us to one day be able to exist with God in heaven, separate from sin, pain, suffering, and death. Be in His presence without any need for anything. No pain or sorrow, no need, because there's a great abundance of our necessities and the things that we rely on in order to survive. So one of the things that I want us to make mention of is be reminded of the fact that even from the very beginning of creation itself, even before we even see the first sin be experienced within the garden, this blueprint was already laid. This blueprint for a place in which God and man can exist together. Now, the moment that we're introduced to sin, and the moment that we begin to see this sin become a part of human life, we're introduced to another aspect of God's plan. That is His plan for redemption. And one of the things that is very important for us to grasp in this is that it was not an afterthought. We've made mention of this time and time again, but I want us to make sure that we reaffirm it. The plan for redemption was not an afterthought. God was not shocked or surprised when Adam and Eve partook of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil that they were not supposed to. God did not have this ultimate plan to exist with man forever and not expect for man not to sin. He is all-knowing. He's all-powerful. He is all-present. He knew that man was going to sin. So don't ever think that this plan for redemption that God has is some sort of afterthought. Well, no. I've created man and now they've sinned. What am I going to do now? I guess I'll send my son. No, this was from the beginning. We've made mention of the fact that even from the beginning of time itself that Jesus was present. Throughout the entirety of the Bible, Jesus is present. And throughout eternity, Jesus will be present even on the day of judgment, both as the lawgiver and as the law. Both as the book of life and as the one who accepts those into the fold of God because their name is written within the book of life. Now, one thing that I wanted us to make mention of, let's see here. When we look at section number 2 under the subtlety of the serpent, it's this idea of seeing what God is keeping from you, or looking to what God is keeping from you. Now, I don't want you to get confused by this and be saying that God is keeping something from you and it's something that you need to know. I'm saying this was the mindset of the devil. This was the mindset of the serpent, leading Adam and Eve astray. The greatest temptation was that he was trying to make them think that this God that they have been serving is somehow keeping something, or for some reason keeping something from you. Now, let me ask you something. Before they partook of the fruit, was God keeping something from Adam and Eve? Yes or no? Sin. And therefore the shame of sin and the punishment of sin. Now He warned them that the moment they ate of it, that they would be dead. But He was keeping that experience from them. Why? Because He understood the dangers of sin. So when the serpent looks to this instance between man and God, the serpent's goal is to point out this thing and say, God's keeping something from you. Okay, when we think about maybe things that we possess in our homes. I know when I was a kid, it was very, very clear that we had to take certain precautions and follow certain rules as it pertained to firearms. Why? Well, because they're dangerous and they can be hurtful if misused or used improperly. So my father and my mother laid down very strict rules about the handling of firearms. Why? Because they understood the pain and suffering that could be caused if handled or mishandled, or handled improperly or mishandled. And so when we look at these ideas of maybe things that God are keeping from us, think of it in the same way. God did not want man to sin because God understood the consequences of the pain and suffering of sin. He understood what it would do to man. I mean, you have to think about something. We may mention this a couple times, the idea that after this first sin had entered into the world, within exactly the next chapter, we don't know the exact timeline, but at least the next chapter after sin enters into this world, the next sin that we see is murder. And so what a big leap, eating of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil to murder. Okay? You have to understand that God knew that even something as simple as eating of this fruit would lead down this path. Put ourselves in the shoes of Adam and Eve in this moment. Cain killed who in the story of Cain and Abel? His brother. Okay, now remember, who is the parents, or who are the parents of Cain and Abel? Adam and Eve. Okay, so you have to put ourselves in their shoes for a moment. Okay, this isn't some Bible character that we're not familiar with. This isn't some person that didn't really exist. There's just stuff written about them. This is the children of Adam and Eve, the offspring of Adam and Eve. They're brothers. They grew up together. They experienced life together. They shared love for each other and love for their parents. But yet jealousy and this sin overtook the emotions of Cain, causing him to kill his own brother. Never neglect to think about the fact that Cain and Abel weren't just two brothers that one got jealous and killed the other. These were their children. These were their offspring.
When Cain didn't offer the proper sacrifice, that wasn't a sin.
I'm sorry?
When Cain didn't.
Yes, ma'am. The offering of the wrong sacrifice. Yes, ma'am. Excuse me when I say that. The offering of the wrong sacrifice was not pleasing to God, therefore would not have been acceptable to God. So technically, the second sin that we have record of is the bad offering, the misused offering. The third would be that. But even then, look at the connections between that. Eating of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and then in some senses you could make the argument that it's idolatry. Not doing things the way that God does, not worshiping God things the way that God wants you to worship Him, but worship Him your own way, giving Him sacrifices that are unacceptable to Him. And then the next would be murder.
But Cain doing that led to the murder.
Led to the murder. It's that progression down that wrong path. But never neglect the fact that we have to put ourselves in Adam and Eve's shoes and realize this isn't just two people that we see on a piece of paper. These aren't just two made-up names. These were the sons of Adam and Eve. These were their children. They loved Cain and they loved Abel. And now one has killed the other. So you think the pain and the suffering that Adam and Eve would have been experiencing after learning the fact that their son has just killed their other son. You think about maybe some interviews you've seen of people who experienced something similar. Pain and the suffering of the loss of a child. Pain and suffering, especially in the hands of another child. You could imagine the pain and suffering that Adam and Eve were facing. And then you could probably also imagine the thought that was in their mind.
Something I never thought of too, in defending the faith, it said that by the time Cain killed Abel, they could have had multiple children and restricted it. And it even said that Cain could have been 99 years old. We're not told, so it said it could be 900.
And I think the fact that it would lead you to think that, well, otherwise it would have been Adam's responsibility to do the sacrifice.
Yeah.
They would have had no obligation to do sacrifice.
As he would have been the patriarch.
It's of their own homes, in the patriarchal in the way that they were taught. And also, he knew the consequences of strife. They had been doing sacrifice. There was death in the world at that time. They did kill animals for food. They did. So it wasn't like, and as a kid, I always thinking, well, he's a teenager, you're going to have
Yeah,
that's not so. They had been living their lives using the land the way that God had taught them. They had been making sacrifices. They knew striking or stabbing or whatever you might do would end life. So it wasn't
ignorant.
It wasn't out of ignorance. He didn't know the consequences of it.
God would not
we
have
understand the
condemned him.
consequences of our.
God would not have condemned him for offering the product of his field if he had not told him.
Yeah, that's true. That's part of the justice of God. Had there not been strict instructions, there would have been no guidelines or basis for judgment to be pronounced. When we look at some of the other things that maybe God is keeping from man, or at least that's the story that the serpent is trying to tell. Let's remember something about the devil, okay? What is the devil's native tongue or native language? Deceit and deception. Okay, what is his goal? Destruction. Of who? Of me. Of me and you. He wants to see us suffer and be separated from God. Okay, so keep that in mind as we look to some of the things that we see here. Notice one of the things that he says that God is keeping from Adam and Eve. You look at verses 4 and 5. I don't think I put it on the slide. No, I didn't. He said, "But the serpent said to the woman, you will not surely die. For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be open and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." The first thing that the serpent is trying to keep, or is trying to say that God is keeping from them, is this magical knowledge, this magical understanding of something. And once again, we mention the fact that this was true. They're eating of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. They were going to gain this understanding of something. But he didn't explain everything. He didn't give the fine print. When you look at the next one, it says, I love the way that this is worded, the knot in the serpent's tail. Because, a little play on words there, y'all get that one? Yeah. The knot in the serpent's tail. Verse 4 of chapter 3. We've made mention of this several times as well. You will not surely die. The changing of simply one word makes all the difference in the meaning itself. We made mention of this, John 8:44. You are of your father the devil, and your will is to do your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in truth, because there is no truth in him. When he speaks, when he lies, he speaks out of his own character, for he is a liar and the father of lies. Notice what is mentioned here in John 8:44. You're of the father of the devil, which, not a very light thing to say to somebody. And your will is to do your father's desires. Okay, what is the father's desires? He was a murderer from the beginning. Okay, we're at the beginning. We're looking at that beginning aspect of time. Okay, so how from this can we glean that Satan is a murderer from the beginning? Anybody know? I'll give you a hint. You eat of the fruit, you shall surely die. What does he say? Eat of the fruit. He is introducing man to death. He is bringing death to humanity. He is fulfilling his goal in a sense. And in fact, he seems to have somewhat of a confidence within this. You'll notice in verse 5 of Genesis 3. For God knows that you will eat of it, and your eyes will be open, and you will be like God, knowing both good and evil. He is leading them into him with this lie, but at the same time, he is introducing death into the world, into man. He's killing man, separating man from God both spiritually and physically in this instance. And so you think, if God designed the garden to be a place where God and man can exist together, and they can do so without pain or suffering or death, without need, because of great abundance, and Satan is the one responsible for introducing these individuals to sin, well, what else is he introducing them into? Pain, suffering, sorrow, death. And a need for things rather than abundance. A need for things because they're going to be removed from the garden. I wanted to throw this in here. Look at the empty promises here of Satan. Notice he promised this idea of open eyes. That was his thing that he's trying to get Adam and Eve to see, or the thing that he's trying to get them to wrap their heads around or have a concept of. Well, you're not surely going to die. And God just doesn't want you to eat fruit because he knows that the moment you eat of it, your eyes will be open. You will know both good and evil. Okay, so one of the first promises, the first empty promise here of Satan, other than the knot of his statement about God's statement. But one of the first empty promises that he offers is this idea of open eyes. Yes, in one sense, their eyes are open, but there were many consequences that were added to it. Many dangers that were added to it. The next promise. He promised a position with God himself. You will be like God. That's a pretty bold statement. You have to think Adam and Eve are existing within the presence of God in the garden. They're experiencing His power. They're experiencing His magnificence. And then they're being told by the serpent, you will be like God. Well, that's a pretty grand thing to think about. I'm like, that's wonderful power, something to look up to or look forward to. Okay, another one of His empty promises. He promised life instead of death. You will not surely die. Okay, so notice all these promises are empty promises.
But they didn't know what death or evil was.
Yeah.
This time, did they?
I'm not sure their full concept of it because we're just not really giving evidence, but obviously it had not existed beforehand, or at least had been spoken of beforehand. So from the indication, like we said, they might have understood there are consequences for these actions, but what that actually entails, they have no idea until after they. Any thoughts on that section? I know we spent like an hour between the 2 weeks on that one section. But any thoughts on that section before we move on? All right, section number 2. Let's see here. All right, section 2. The sin of man. Notice here in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 6. Actually, let's go back to verse 4 and 5. Just quick refresh. You will not surely die. Verse 4. Your eyes will be open. You will be like God. Verse 5. Verse 6. So. Okay, when we see that word so there, it's giving indication of these actions are occurring based on what we have seen in the past. So based on these promises of Satan, based on these things that he has said to them, this woman now, when the woman sees that the tree was good for food, and thought it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. She gave also some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. Okay, I want us to pause here and think for just a second. When I say just a second, it's probably going to be 30 minutes. Sorry about that. But I want us to pause here for just a moment and think on these things. Okay, why is Eve partaking of this fruit? Not just because it's a desire for her, but why is Eve partaking of this fruit? What got her in this position that she's partaking of this fruit?
Temptation.
The temptations? I'll give you a hint. It's kind of on the screen behind us. False promises, empty
She wanted to be
promises.
like God.
She wanted to be like God. Okay? Remember, what was the purpose of Eve to Adam and Adam to Eve? To be each other's helpmeet. To be together with each other. Okay? So when we see Eve falling into this temptation, she wasn't given the fruit to Adam so that he could also fall into this temptation. She was given this fruit to Adam because she wanted him to prosper the same way that she was supposed to prosper. Be like God. Have the knowledge like God. So what does she do? She looks at this fruit, sees that it's desirable, sees that it can make one wise like God. So she partakes of the fruit and then she gives it to Adam. Why? Because she loves and cares for him. She wants maybe this for him as well.
Wonder why he didn't question her. Were her eyes open before his?
Say that again?
Were her eyes open before his? Before, she ate and then gave it to him, so as soon as she ate, she had to know.
The only indication we have of that, I believe, is in verse 7. The eyes of both were opened. So it doesn't give an order or she ate of it and gave it to him knowing what it was going to do. The only indication that we have is that she gave it to her husband and he ate of it as well, and the eyes of both of them were open.
And the only thing we see that they received, the only epiphany
Yeah.
was shame.
Yeah. Well, they had their eyes open.
That's right. It was,
They knew what God now knew.
nothing else was that, it's not listed to us like that. It was on the shame. They realized their negatives. So it wasn't some great. I don't believe it was some great epiphany that you the answer to everything in the universe. That wasn't. That was.
They didn't get miraculous knowledge.
Right.
In fact, the only indication that we're given is that they knew that they were naked and they were shamed. And when we look at this as well, we understand a little bit more of this opening of their eyes. They both realized maybe what they had done, but I still don't think that they would have understood the full amount of it. I mean, you think after the being kicked out of the garden, after the curses being placed on them, maybe even after the death of their son and the bad sacrifice offered by their other son and murdering his own brother, with each sin, I think they would see more and more of those consequences. To me, the first thing that my mind goes to is things that my parents kept from me when I was a kid, because they knew that it might be harmful. Later on they'd tell me, and be like, "Why didn't you say anything?" Well, because we knew that it would be maybe hard for you to understand. We knew that it would be painful for you. The only thing that we can see that God was keeping from them was the shame of sin, because that's what they begin to experience. Yes, ma'am.
God had told Adam that they were not to eat of that tree.
Mm-hmm.
Now I wonder why he didn't question Eve and said, "What have you done?"
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, the question was pointed at him.
He went along with her, and so.
Yeah. Well, and you also think about that too. What is Adam's responsibility to Eve at this point? It's the same responsibility that husbands have to their wives today. To take care of them, to nourish them and cherish them, and to be their spiritual head of the household. And so you think as this helpmeet is for that Adam and Eve have, these working together towards a common goal, it was Adam's responsibility to make sure they didn't partake of this fruit. Now, they each, of course, had their own free will, but Adam has to answer for this as well.
Who did the serpent speak to first?
Yeah, the woman.
Well, in this version it says, and she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate.
And he ate.
And he might have been out there with her,
Yeah.
and she took a bite, and he took a bite.
That's how, when I read it, that's how I've always pictured it. It's not like she goes about for a week carrying it. Yeah.
He was off in the garden somewhere else,
Yeah.
and didn't know she had been, if he was right there with her, then
He's experiencing the same thing.
Serpent, and all, it's not,
Well, in the first verse of chapter 3, it says the serpent spoke to the woman.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't it?
Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm.
All right, so it says he was talking to her and asked her if they could eat of every tree in the garden. So it sounded like to me he addressed her, whether she was weaker in judgment than Adam, or I don't know, or whether they were together at the same time or not. It doesn't say.
Mm-hmm.
I don't believe she was, I don't believe they were together when he talked to her, that serpent.
We really.
Stand there and looking and listening, and not say a word.
Yeah. Well, you have to think too, one of the things that we mentioned last week, that this could have been somebody who they saw, I mean, he was cunning, he was deceptive. So in their eyes, he could have been trustworthy. I mean, that's what makes it so deceptive.
She wasn't surprised to see him nor afraid.
No. So, I mean, this serpent's hanging from a tree from what we can see in scripturally, because he ain't on the ground yet. That don't come until a few verses later. And the serpent begins to talk to you, and she's not, what's going on here? Why is this snake talking to me? Or the serpent talking to me? It seems as if this is maybe not a common thing, but at least it's not so out of the ordinary. I mean, if a snake began to talk to me, my reaction wouldn't be, "Oh yeah, of course, yeah." Probably have a little bit more. And he ran fervently away from in terror.
Well, it's a good example. We can be deceived sometimes by that which we don't think is dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
She was the object of his attack.
Mm-hmm.
And so, he knew that she was made from a real family, and that she was a wicked person.
Well, and you think too, what does Scripture tell us about the way that God draws us away? The way the devil draws us away from God. Temptation is when we are drawn away because of our own lusts and desires. Maybe this thing that was tempting her was not tempting to him, but yet his trust in her allowed for the serpent to get to Adam.
1 Timothy 2:14.
There we go.
The woman was deceived first, and then the man.
And Adam was not deceived But the woman deceived and became a transgressor.
That's right.
There you go.
Thank you.
I've always looked at it as a divide and conquer. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but it's always the thought that I had was, had they both been together at the same time, it might not have happened.
Yeah.
You know, and-
Could have been surprised. I don't know about this, you know.
Yeah, I mean, and because it's a tool the devil uses on us all the time, you know, when we were all together, or, you know, I remember especially when we went to camp, you know,
Yeah.
and working, and, you know, there was nothing you couldn't do. There was, you know, you were with folks, and you were all singing and thinking and doing the same thing, and I remember the fire that it gives you and all, and then you get back home, you play yourself again, and you go to school, and it's not the same people, and, you know, and the vulnerabilities that come in, you don't feel or have those vulnerabilities. People of like faith, you know, that's the reason church, and I think this is so important, and being together in fellowship, and all that's so important is the strength we gain.
Yeah.
It's when we're standoff.
Yeah.
It's when we come to church but are invisible. It's when we, you know.
It's that sheep that's wandered off.
That's right.
This is the one the wolf looks at. You know, the first person that comes to my mind is David. You know, when did the devil pull David down from his highest point? When he's alone on a rooftop. Not when he's surrounded by his servants or the prophet, not the prophets, the high priests or anything like that. You think David, he's got contact with some very intelligent individuals. In fact, he's got direct contact with God throughout his life, but yet the moment when the devil pulls him away is the moment when he's alone.
You know, the picture that is, where should David have been? Where was he?
On the battlefield.
Chastised for not being.
Yeah, should have been
At
fighting.
war.
Yeah,
So he
with
was
others.
safer
At war.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah,
Because that was where his responsibilities lay. That was the people that he should have been in. They had his back and he should have had their back. Therefore, he was safer in that spot.
If we focus more on doing what's right, we'll focus less on having to worry about not doing what's wrong. We keep our eyes on the prize, keep pushing together, and we're not led off like a sheep, then we don't have to worry about the wolves. Except for the ones that creep in sheep's clothing. You know, there's a whole other chapter about that in the Bible. But other than that, yes, sir.
I just wanted to look back in chapter 2 where God told Adam not to eat of the fruit of the good knowledge of good and evil. That's before he made Eve. In the next verse, that's in verse 17. And in verse 18, he talks about, he made the woman to be a helpmate for it. Here we go in chapter 3, and she's being confronted with the devil, the serpent. And she's telling him we can't eat of that tree. So apparently Adam did his job in informing her of what was permissible and what wasn't. What that she didn't know. Probably the scene that I get out of this is she's there, the serpent's there, Adam's not there. But then it gets down to verse 4, and when the serpent, verse 6, and probably some time has elapsed between that verse 5 and verse 6. And when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, it was pleasant to the eyes, it was desired to make one wise, she took the fruit thereof. And then it says, and she gave to her husband with her, and he did eat. So the implication is that she may have been by herself when she was tempted. And then sometime later, she approaches the tree with her husband. And she takes the fruit and gives it to him. Because Paul talks about it to Timothy that, the husband, he wanted to see first she was deceived, not him. He knew what he was doing. But she knew what she was doing too, but she bought into this deceit, the lie we talk about.
Would that not be worse for Adam though?
Yeah, I don't think so.
I mean, because he didn't just hear it from his spouse.
God spoke directly to him, you don't do this. Anything else you want to eat, you can be welcome to it. But there's one tree you stay away from it. And he told his wife, and told Eve and his wife, and the same thing. But he got it right directly from God. So there shouldn't be any doubt in his mind about whether he should or shouldn't. But then again,
Seems like we talked about this here recently, didn't we? We were just having a conversation beforehand about Daniel setting his heart to do what's right. And that our way through temptation is that we don't make the decision at the point of temptation or at the moment of temptation. The mindset is made up beforehand. It's not when you're faced with two options which do I choose? It's you make up your mind, I'm going to choose what's right. I go with my right hand for what's right. I'll choose what's right. So the moment you do face that decision, you know immediately go for what is right.
When Jesus was tempted.
Like today, I mean, back then, I think he was running enough to know who to go to.
Oh yeah.
Just like he is today, he teaches us in our weakest and he counsels us. We have to be guarded for those times. Whatever it happens, whenever it happens, we have to be strong enough to fight him off.
Even in our weakest points, we have to be strong. Yes, ma'am?
Like when Jesus was tempted by Satan, and he showed him all the kingdoms of the world and promised it to him, that Jesus knew that it wasn't Satan's to give him.
Yep. He could see past the empty promises. In fact, when you look at the two temptations, both are identical in their promises. You know, the lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, pride of life. Those three temptations were present with both parties. The difference was that when Adam and Eve were presented, or at least when Eve was presented with this, she focused less on what God said and more on what he didn't. You know, that promise of you shall not surely die. Again, listen to the promises of Satan. And Jesus' response was, it is written, it is written, it is written. Always pointing back to the word of God for his defense. You have something as well?
I've heard it, I've actually heard a lesson, and but I read it different ways sometimes, but it says, you know, you shouldn't eat, not to eat of they were commanded not to eat of the tree. And then in another place, they say, neither shall we touch it. And the point of the lesson was, you know, God may not have told them not to touch it.
That was the addition of them.
So,
Yeah.
you know, and then, you know, when the Satan was sitting there and tempting her, and you can just envision them holding it and handing it to her, and nothing happens, and you know, and so how do you step into, how do you, first of all, put limitations that God don't put. That's unattainable and not reachable or not what he intended. And then when you get to that threshold and then nothing happens, God didn't say it would happen there.
Yeah.
You know, and then all of a sudden you deceive yourself with your own rule, with your own, you know.
You're taking down your own barriers.
Pharisees were really, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, they were.
You know, they wanted to be ultra. That, you know, God says this, and we're going to go even, you know, back here. So that's a problem that we even have, you know, today with different things. You know, we talk about different things with different people and stuff. So we need to be careful about setting those. And I don't know whether God told them to touch it or not to touch it, but that was the point of the lesson.
Listen, it was their own safety net that they put in place.
That's right.
Well, I mean, we understand that concept fairly easily in practice. If your addiction is alcohol, don't go to the sports bar to watch football, even though it's got a big TV there. I mean, don't surround yourself with the temptation, because it'll be easier for you to partake it if it's available. You know, at least when I picture the two, I would imagine that this was somewhere that they probably tried to stay away from, for the most part at least, put those own barriers up. And like you said, that was the problem with the Pharisees. But their problem was that they said that it was unlawful to break their own safety nets. Well, you can't even touch it. But God never said that, you know. But I said it, you know. And so that's where their problem came in.
But it's so important what Joe W. said, that God had already in 2:16 told Adam, you know, and commanded him not to eat the tree of good and evil. He knew, so really he was responsible for the downfall of the world.
And that's hard to think about. You know, I had a question from my dad when I was younger. What would have happened had Adam and Eve never eaten of the fruit? And Dad said it probably would have been their kids. You know, don't think that just for a moment that had they resisted this one time, it never would have happened again. In fact, we have no indication that this was the first time that they had ever been tempted by the serpent to eat it. The only thing that we know is that this happened at some point and they partook of it. There could have been moments before when they were still tempted by it,
And
but never
time is
took
our
care of it.
constraint, not God's. It was still been in the garden.
Say that again?
Time is our constraint, not God's.
Yeah.
Could have still been in the garden.
Yeah.
You know, we don't.
Yeah.
We get a play in those games, we don't have it.
Yeah, yeah, for real, yeah.
We got to God Moses enough that he didn't want us to suffer.
And from the moment that they took of this fruit, it became his number one priority to bring everybody back.
So if you think about it as well, you know, God didn't set them up to fail. He knew they were going to fail. He didn't set them up to fail. But he also set them up to be able to be okay afterwards.
Yeah.
You know, they were not unskilled. They were not unlearned. They had been taking care of the garden. They had been tending to things. They had been, eating. It was provided for them, but they knew how. That was their job, was to be
Cultivators.
of the flocks, of the animals, of the garden, of the plants, of all. So God had them prepared. They were prepared for when He made things done. It was a lot more work afterwards, and they had to struggle and strive for it. But God don't leave you without the tools to continue to go on with, however hard it may be.
And you have to think too, He had set them up just as much for success as He did failure.
Right.
They still had the option not to eat of the fruit. And there was a far better reward for not eating of it. And so it was not even a 50-50 shot, because this is one tree. And they got a whole garden that they can touch. Just don't eat of this one. And so they didn't have to do this. I mean, this was He set them up to be able to be there forever. But like you said, He also set them up for even after they had fallen and failed. And we're thinking the same thing. That's why repentance exists in the first place. God offers the sacrifice of His Son, the cleansing blood of His Son, but then He also offers repentance after the fact that you have been cleansed from your sins. Why? Well, because He understands that even if you have this thing that cleanses you and sets you free and brings you to Him, you can still choose to go away. But yet there's still that thing that can bring you back.
And I think there's another lesson that God didn't destroy the garden.
No. He just took them out of it.
In our minds, the garden in heaven, or in my mind, the garden in heaven have a lot of similarities in it. But God didn't destroy it, didn't take it away. It was still there, but He prevented them from being in it. Heaven, we picture heaven with gates. We see the Garden of Eden with an angel with a fiery sword.
Yeah. Nobody gets past him.
But our mentality is, well, if we can't do it, we'll just destroy all of it. We'll
Yeah.
just make it work. With not an intention for it, that's not what God does and what God is.
When you think too, that, like you mentioned, we have no indication that garden was destroyed. Maybe you can make the argument that maybe it got destroyed in the flood. You can make the argument for that, but at the same time, there's still that promise of hope that existed. I mean, whether the garden physically, if every tree and every leaf was still there, doesn't matter. That garden itself, that promise of the garden, that being with God is the promise that continues to exist.
1 Peter 1:18-23 talks about, Jesus' blood, and He was foreordained before the foundation of the world to die for us and to save us the hope. And we need to teach our children this from eternity to eternity. They've always been there, and this has always been a plan. And Jesus had to dread that all this time. He knew what was coming, but He loved us so much He never let that just touches me.
I was reading a book here recently, and the author repeated the phrase multiple times so that we wouldn't forget it. And one of the things that he mentioned was, and while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. And he said, I want you to read it 5 times more. While we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. It wasn't this, they've sinned, they're hopeless. It's this, they've sinned, and I'm still going to redeem them. I'm still going to give them the hope. I'm still going to give them mercy and forgiveness. It's beautiful to me. It's comforting. Verse, we don't even have time to even read it. Verse 7 and 8 is where we're going to pick up. I'm greatly looking forward to the study, and I'll tell you why. Because I knew in my heart, even though I had already planned for 13 weeks for this quarter, I knew in my heart we were going to do this the whole year. So that's why I set aside this whole year for us to do this study, because I knew good and well that we weren't going to make it past chapter 1 in time. And I think we got past chapter 1 the first week, but we didn't make it past chapter 2. But we'll pick up in chapter 3 and verse 7 and 8 and pick up on the idea of shame. I would encourage you, especially to set our minds in the right place for next week. Go ahead and read through the rest of the chapter 3. We might touch a little bit into chapter 4 next week. But we're going to spend a lot of time in chapter 3 and really understanding some of these consequences to the fullest extent, or at least to the best extent that we can in our time here. So read the rest of chapter 3 and we'll pick up there. Thank you.